So welcome and good early evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute of Humanities here at SFU. Gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our final webinar panel in the series that we've been running over the last few months on thinking through the pandemic. I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Bhaskar people. So beginning in late 2020, this series has covered topics including the climate emergency, the Green New Deal, the inadequacies of existing public healthcare systems, big tech, surveillance, and policing, the question of basic universal income, as well as other debates about how to achieve an economic recovery that reduces rather than widens inequality. Today's concluding session brings an explicitly political lens to the global social crisis, invoking an aphorism variously attributed to Winston Churchill and Rahm Emanuel. Never let a good crisis to waste. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Today, we look at how the forces of the political left can win as we emerge from this global and societal crisis. And what would winning look like anyway in a world in which capitalist realism still seems to limit the horizon of the possible? Winning office on a left or progressive program is, of course, not the same as winning power for working and oppressed people. This is a basic point, but one that needs to be made here in BC, where North America's only state or provincial level social democratic government has more than doubled subsidies to oil and gas corporations and pushed through pipelines across Indigenous lands against massive and growing opposition. To help tackle these questions today, we have an international panel featuring two of the longest serving and most dynamic elected socialists anywhere in North America, the founding publisher of the preeminent publication of the re-emerging left in the United States, Jacobin, as well as a leading philosopher and political commentator from Latin America. So each of our panelists will speak for approximately 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, Q&A afterwards. We welcome your questions and discussion, which you can feel free to engage in the chat. The questions should be placed in the Q&A section of Zoom. That way we can better parse through them and direct them towards the panelists. As I said, the event is recorded, so just bear that in mind, if you like. Just like to take the opportunity then to thank Devin Gillen for his videography, his taping and production of this event and previous ones he's done in the past. He's been working with us for the last few years. Special thanks also to Derek O'Keefe for curating this series of talks and this event tonight, of course, as well. And to Yan Pham for all the work that she does for the Institute as a program assistant. So now let me just go on to introduce the speakers, and they will be speaking in the order in which I introduced them. So first off will be Nikki Ashton, who's the NDP Member of Parliament for Churchill Kiwatanuk Aski in Manitoba, first elected in 2008 at age 26. She was re-elected in 2011, 2015, and 2019. Nikki is a council member for the Progressive International and will be participating in this weekend's global conference on vaccine internationalism hosted by the International. Kshama Sawant is a Seattle City Council member and a member of the Socialist Alternative. She has served on the Seattle City Council since 2014 and was most recently re-elected in 2019 despite a massive effort to defeat her by Amazon and other corporate interests. Kshama has played a key role in the movement for $15 an hour minimum wage. Bhaskar Sunkara is the editor and publisher of Jacobin, as well as a publisher of the scholarly journal Catalyst and UK-based Tribune. He's the author of the Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. Vladimir Safatle is professor of philosophy and psychology at the University of Sao Paulo and has been visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and an invited professor at the Université de Paris and Louvain. A special thank you to Vladimir, who has done so much work with the Institute over the past couple of years for making himself available at such a late hour. I think it's 1 in the morning. So thank you, Vladimir, for agreeing to participate. So without any further ado, I'd just like to turn it over to Nikki Ashton. Nikki, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm just so thrilled to be here. I would like to first acknowledge that I am joining you from Treaty 5 territory, the traditional territory of the Nisitawasi Cree Nation, from my home community of Thompson, Manitoba, in Northern Canada. I want to thank the Institute of the Humanities, the organizers of this important gathering, my good friend Derek O'Keefe, and everyone involved who've brought us together to have a very critical discussion about charting the way forward for the left here at home and around the world. It's been over a year where our world was hit by COVID-19, the COVID crisis. It was over a year ago when everybody kept saying that we're all in this together. And it was very soon after that we figured out that we most definitely weren't all in this together. This past year of the pandemic has proven clearly how the systems are broken. The neoliberal agenda has proven not only dangerous, but deadly for many. Deadly for millions of people. Here in Canada, COVID has proven deadly for our elderly, for Indigenous communities, and for workers. Canada has lost more elderly people living in care homes than any other wealthy country. 14,000 elders that have died in our care homes. Indigenous communities in our country have been hit hard. In fact, here in my own province of Manitoba, 70% of the COVID cases were amongst Indigenous people, even though they are only 30% of the population. And we know that the second and third waves of COVID-19 have hit working people especially hard. Frontline workers, workers in long-term care, workers in meatpacking plants, in warehouses, taxi drivers, migrant workers, many of them racialized, many of them immigrants. Working people were forced to work throughout this pandemic without personal protective equipment, without paid sick leave, without targeted shutdowns, without vaccines. They've been forced by employers, corporations, governments that have chosen to prioritize profits ahead of the lives of working people and their families. Women workers have also lost significant ground. Inequality and the lack of structural supports like childcare are still holding us back. And we know that workers have paid for this crisis with their lives and the lives of their families. We cannot afford the status quo. We must fight back. We need a transformative vision for our world, one that seeks to prioritize the well-being of people and our planet over profits. A vision rooted in the power of the collective and collective action. A vision of a world where racial justice, social justice, environmental justice, and economic justice are not just slogans, but a reality. A world of peace. And many are on the front lines of fighting for this world. The ground is shifting. From struggles for decolonization to a living wage to racial justice to an end to imperialism to the need for a Green New Deal. People are fighting back. We are seeing the power of people's movements in the global south, from Peru to Bolivia. We're seeing bold activism rise against authoritarian regimes from Brazil to India. And we're seeing clear pushes against imperialism from Cuba and many others. We're seeing ways here in our own country, in Canada, where people and movements are pushing for change. Looking ahead, I believe we need to be clear on two key fronts. First, our message needs to be clear. To get there, we need bold, progressive ideas rooted in principle. We must demand a transformative vision for our world coming out of this pandemic, a vision where people, where lives come ahead of profit. We must be clear that right-wing governments didn't just mismanage this deadly pandemic. They consciously made choices that exploited, oppressed, and ultimately killed people. We saw in this pandemic time and time again that progressive, publicly owned and publicly driven measures saved lives. We know here in Canada that if we still had a publicly owned laboratory like the Connaught Labs privatized in the 1980s, a lab at the forefront of developing vaccines, not only for our country, but for countries around the world, we would have been better off. Instead, then and now, Canada has chosen to place Big Pharma's profits ahead of the well-being of people. We saw time and time again during this pandemic in our country and elsewhere that direct measures to lift people out of poverty, including income supports, kept people safe. We know that if workers made a living wage and if they had paid sick leave, many of them, particularly essential workers in places like packing plants, warehouses, and work camps, would be safe. Second, we need to build solidarity. We need to connect to people's day-to-day struggles. Leaders like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn do this work every day and have been leading voices even throughout this pandemic. We know that there are challenges. Neoliberalism has eroded the power and strength of organized labor. The trade union movement has not been as vocal and as visible as we needed them to be. Unionization rates are declining, and the rise of an increasingly precarious working class means that many workers are not being represented. Neoliberalism has pushed all of us to feel like we're just individuals trying to make it out on our own. But the ground is shifting. Grassroots labor activists and non-unionized workers are organizing in new and dynamic ways, from Amazon warehouses to manufacturing plants. It's clear we need to fight for workers' right to organize. We need to stand with workers who are fighting back. And I'm thinking of steelworker members of Local 6500 in Sudbury that are right now on strike against Vale, a mining multinational. Members voted to go on strike against the recommendations of their own bargaining committee because they had enough and they're fighting back. We need to stand in solidarity and fight for workers that have been fighting for protections and safety throughout this pandemic. And I think of the struggle that I and others were involved in solidarity with workers and First Nations at the kiosk work camp involved in the hydro dam that's being built just north of our region here, where the corporation demanded that workers work full capacity despite the threat of COVID-19. The challenges of our time, we must be clear, are challenges shared by people around the world. There's so much more that binds us together. The rise of the far right, the rise of inequality, the threat of the climate emergency. Many workers, many people in our communities are taking on these struggles, and many are recognizing that the struggles for justice are intertwined. The recent discovery of 215 children at the Kamloops residential school onto Kamloops territory has reopened wounds and fueled calls for decolonization. There's been another wave of recognition that the genocidal actions of the federal government and the churches, including through residential schools, had the clear intent of the colonizers to quote unquote clear the land for profits. Indigenous peoples are fighting back and demanding justice. The struggle is centered on many committed to decolonization. This struggle is centered, and many are on those who are fighting for decolonization and pushing back, demanding justice. Demanding an end to the status quo is critical. We must fight alongside in solidarity. I acknowledge the work of Black Lives Matter activists, including in our own country, who've led a movement of change, to calling on defunding the police, and who've made it clear that we need a transformative vision for racial justice. And the work of climate justice activists, many of whom have made clear that the exploitation of working people, of Indigenous peoples and lands, mean we are in desperate need of a bold vision for change. I want to take a moment as well to acknowledge what was acknowledged off the top, is that we need our political parties and our movements to put forward bold ideas based on principle. We don't need another focus group. We don't need to water down what we say we believe in. We need bold policy, and we need to connect to the struggles of day-to-day people. We must be clear that our struggles for justice are intertwined here at home and around the world. I'm proud of the work that Progressive International is doing, including the upcoming Vaccine International Summit, and I encourage folks to tune in, because we must look at ways of building solidarity internationally, learning from struggles across our borders, supporting one another in these common struggles. Movements are pushing back against anti-worker, authoritarian, fascist regimes worldwide. And today we recommit to supporting these struggles led by Indigenous peoples, struggles led by workers, struggles led by migrant workers, by racialized and immigrant peoples, by women, by all of us. We stand together in solidarity, and we look for ways that we can strengthen those bonds and reinforce our push based on bold progressive ideas. And ultimately, the goal of pursuing racial, social, and economic, environmental justice for all is something that drives so many. Let's keep going, and let's stand strong with one another. Let's keep up the fight. Our future depends on it. Thank you.
So Kshama, over to you. Thank you very much, Nikki.
Thank you to the organizers, and really appreciate being alongside my fellow speakers. The fundamental question facing the left in the wake of this unprecedented crisis year is, will the multiple crises of humanity be solved on the basis of capitalism through Keynesian policies or other reforms? The stimulus spending in the United States has been remarkable, but has no long-term gains for the American working class. Capitalism as a system has proven itself incapable of providing for even access to affordable housing. And certainly racism and other forms of oppression are endemic to capitalism, because it's a system that needs to systematically exploit a mass of humanity. And to succeed, it needs to divide the working class. As another example, doubles down on the failed strategy of creating corporate incentives and the idea of public-private partnership, where the private corporations get richer and the public gets screwed. It fails to include public jobs programs, a massive expansion of clean energy, of high-speed public transit, bringing the energy industry into democratic public ownership, and taxing the rich and corporations to fund massive reforestation and weatherization programs. The logic of capitalism also blocks the global cooperation that is needed because of inter-imperialist rivalries, which are also endemic to global capitalism, with capitalists in one country refusing to seriously address climate emissions to avoid being put at a competitive disadvantage against others in the logic of the global market. It also means hoarding climate technology. We are seeing, in fact, the intensification of these inter-imperialist rivalries, with the new Cold War emerging between the US and China. Both the environment and poor countries will be left behind in the midst of this rivalry. We're already seeing this destructive nationalist competition also in how vaccine access for most of the world has been blocked by Western capitalist powers. Mass struggle will intensify when the ruling class inevitably moves to end many of the stimulus programs of the last year in America, for example, and instead impose more blatant austerity measures. There will be a great deal of anger. There is sharp polarization of society in both a leftward and rightward direction, and an increasing loss of faith in major institutions. In this context, though, if the left does not provide a clear alternative, there is the serious danger of further growth of right populism and the far right. We see disillusionment of growing sections with Biden, especially among youth, and within that, increasing debate on the left about reformist versus revolutionary ideas. Just minutes ago, the New York Times reported President Biden's approval rating has taken a dip in recent weeks, and of course, much more of a drop in support for Congress's performance as negotiations over progressive legislation have ground to a virtual standstill. My organization, Socialist Alternatives, supported Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns, though we disagreed completely with his capitulation when he suspended them to support the Democratic candidates in 2016 and then again last year. But Bernie's platform, including Medicare for All, a $15 minimum wage, ending mass incarceration, and the Green New Deal had a profound impact on mass consciousness. We saw the Black Lives Matter movement turn into the largest street protest movement in US history. And since 2018, we have seen a partial re-emergence of a fighting labor movement. But we will need the right kind of leadership on the left. First and foremost, we need leadership of the left that has no illusions in capitalism as a system that can be molded to fit the needs of humanity. A left leadership that does not fudge the scientific conclusion that we need socialism and that it will require revolutions to get there. Capitalism is a system of crises. It lurches from one crisis to the next. The default, if there is no change in course on the basis of reforms alone, even though the reforms themselves will be hard won, is absolute catastrophe. As Rosa Luxemburg said, it will be socialism or barbarism. We need democratic public ownership of the commanding heights of the global economy to run the major corporations and industry democratically for the interests of working people and the environment, not for the greed of the billionaires. We urgently need international working class solidarity, not quote unquote woke capitalism, not corporate co-optation. For example, it is our duty to build the unity of the working class in fighting against oppression and towards socialism. Black capitalism is not a solution to racism in America. We have to fight against ideas of identity politics that splinter movements and serve the ruling class. And we have to build working class solidarity on a principled basis. We have to understand that we are in a class struggle. That means no alliance with the bosses. We need independent fighting movements. In the US, that means building social movements that are independent of the Democrats, which is a party tied by 1,000 threats to the billionaire class. It also means building militant labor movement with rank and file democracy and a break from business unionism, which is the utterly failed idea that unions should collaborate with the bosses rather than basing themselves on working class unity and struggle. My organization, Socialist Alternative, has used a class struggle approach in all our campaigns in Seattle, including our first election campaign in 2013. We clearly named who our opponents are: big business, the capitalist class, and the two major parties, both of which serve the interests of the bosses. I take home only the average worker's wage and donate the rest of my six-figure salary after taxes into a movement solidarity fund. In Seattle, the only party with any power is the Democratic Party, and still an overwhelming number of our movement's victories began with only one reliable vote on the council, mine, and ultimately passed only under pressure from our fighting movements. The $15 minimum wage victory saw the light of day only because we used our council position to launch the 15 Now grassroots campaign along with progressive labor unions, which overcame not only the opposition of big business and the corporate Democrats, but also the cautious instincts of some labor leaders reluctant to openly clash with the establishment. The 15 Now campaign organized a series of mass conferences, launched neighborhood action groups, held a series of marches, and then democratically decided to file a grassroots ballot initiative so that we could take the issue to voters if Democratic City Council members failed to act. All of this was integral to forcing the hand of big business and the establishment. Socialist Alternative also helped lead the way on winning the Amazon tax last year, which taxes large corporations to fund affordable social housing and Green New Deal projects. The Tax Amazon movement was also organized independently of the city's Democratic politicians. We organized, again, mass action conferences involving hundreds of activists where all major decisions were discussed and democratically voted on. Despite fierce big business opposition and repeated ploys by city and state Democrats during the pandemic to derail it, the movement won during the height of the Black Lives Matter street protests, primarily on the basis of a viable ballot initiative threat similar to 15 Now. In addition, we won a whole series of landmark renters' rights victories, which has the real estate lobby in an uproar. Because of the influence of our socialist politics, the Democratic Party, which controls this city, has been forced to adapt itself away from overtly corporate politicians, and now there is a new crop of progressive Democrats who don't take money from big business or corporate landlords, who use progressive rhetoric in their speech. This is a positive development, but what has not fundamentally changed is the class interest these politicians represent. 5 years ago, I was the only elected representative who was willing to even publicly say Black Lives Matter. Now every politician in Seattle says it, sometimes with tears in their eyes. Nonetheless, after BLM street protests subsided last autumn, these progressive Democrats reneged on all their promises. They gutted the ban we had won on weapons like tear gas. They refused to defund the police by 50% or anywhere near. And state Democrats started talking about undoing or phasing out our Amazon tax. Of course, we urgently need many more socialists and working class representatives in office, but it is not simply about a numerical increase. It is much more about electing representatives who are clear-eyed about how to withstand the pressures of office and understand what a fighting strategy really looks like. It's extremely positive that the Democratic Socialists of America, which I have joined recently, have nearly 100,000 members. Socialist Alternative, which is a much smaller organization, has also grown rapidly. But here again, it is not just growth in membership on the books that matters. It is whether we are able to mobilize and lead working people to victories. Our movement's elected and non-elected leaders in activist organizations, such as DSA and SA, also need to stand up to the pressures of caving to the establishment and cannot give cover to the failures of or betrayals by left elected representatives, including the squad in the United States. Events have proven how it will not be enough to tweet support for an issue or criticize Republicans or symbolically introduce a progressive legislation like Medicare for all or quietly vote a different way than establishment politicians. All this is necessary, but it's not sufficient. In Congress, we will need a serious strategy to actually win Medicare for all based on mobilizing millions of working people behind it and being prepared to clash with the Democratic Party leadership. The reason progressive Democrats in Congress accepted moving the federal $15 minimum wage removing it from the stimulus bill is not really about parliamentary restrictions or legal concerns as they claimed, but because they do not want to go up against big business and the powerful Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and because they were reluctant to use their elected office to build mass movements. And if and when you relentlessly fight for working people, expect the ruling class and their political and media machine to retaliate against you. It is no surprise that we now have a recall attack against our council office in Seattle, and we need international solidarity to fight against it because it's one of the worst attacks against the US left in decades. Unfortunately, in my view, some leading members in DSA are making excuses for the squad rather than putting pressure on them, and we need that to change. The squad, in turn, has repeatedly covered for Biden. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez recently told the town hall that Biden had, quote unquote, exceeded expectations and defended him against valid criticisms from the left. From what I know about Canadian politics, there are, I think, some parallels with the NDP leadership as it tries to find a middle ground between the needs of working people and the greed of big business. We need all of us on the left to join in a complete shift away from this failed middle ground strategy. It's true, for example, that Ocasio-Cortez has faced sharp opposition from the Democratic Party insiders, and we should all stand against it. But at the end of the day, she has demonstrated to them that she is more speech and less action. She has drawn the line against calling out Democratic politicians individually and specifically on their betrayals of working people. Most importantly, as I said, AOC and the squad have refused to use their elected positions as an organ of social struggle, calling for mass actions to win $15 an hour and Medicare for all, for example. It's no surprise to me that AOC coasted in her Democratic re-election last year. A rule of thumb, if as an elected representative on the left, you are not facing ferocious opposition from the establishment during their term in office and your re-election is a cakewalk, then it's a sign that the ruling class does not see you as a threat and you're failing working people. We urgently need a new party for working people, independent of corporate cash, that bases itself on class struggle, on building social movements and the labor movement. There is widespread support for a new party in the United States, the highest polling in favor of this in the history of polling, in fact. As a step towards this, the socialist movement, including our organizations like DSA, should be running independent candidates, as I have done, rather than running as Democrats. And last but not least, we need a global fight back, and we need the international working class to move in coordination if we are to solve the crises facing humanity. So I welcome you to get in touch with Socialist Alternative in your area, whether in Canada or in the United States. We are part of an international organization of socialists, and we have sister organizations in 30 different countries. Reach out to Metro Vancouver Socialist Alternative. And of course, Simon Fraser University students can get involved in Socialist Alternative Youth, which is a registered university club. We have to build an international movement of the working class to fight for and win a socialist society. And I'm really thankful once again for these discussions. Solidarity and thank you.
Thanks very much, Kshama. Over to you, Bhaskar.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and obviously, I'm so pleased to be on a panel filled with so many people committed to the type of politics that I truly do believe can build the type of world that human beings deserve to live in. So, I guess for the main question, how the left wins after the pandemic, I know it's a cliche, but if I knew I had the answer, as much as I enjoy all of your company, I would be out there doing whatever that is right now. I think it's important to have a degree of humility about what we know and our capacity to see the future on the left. I remember being a young socialist and a somewhat more orthodox Marxist maybe a decade ago, and I was not particularly excited about early planning for Occupy Wall Street that was going on that some of my friends were involved with. I thought it was probably a waste of time. I definitely didn't think it was anything worse than that. I didn't understand how the occupation of physical spaces, how tactics drawn in part from the contemporary experience of the student movement in the US and elsewhere could reach a more general audience. And at the time, the left was very isolated. And obviously, I was completely wrong. It really did. Occupy captured the imagination of millions of people. They liked the enemy that we picked. They liked our populist discourse, the language of the 99% versus 1%. And they liked our focus on fighting inequality and austerity. And I remember having similar doubts about to some degree about Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn's initial efforts. I think the first article we ran in Jacobin about Corbyn's 2015 leadership run was basically something along the lines of, we know this guy, we like him, he's honorable, but he can't win. And even if he could, it's the UK Labour Party. And I was, on the other hand, very involved in late 2014, early 2015, advocating a Bernie Sanders run and helping with a draft Bernie campaign that DSA was doing. But again, here we thought that we'd be at best running a candidate on the fringes who would maybe finish, again, in the very best scenario, a very distant second to Hillary Clinton, maybe popularize democratic socialism a bit, plant a flag for left-wing ideas. But not have the same impact that it ended up having. I didn't expect that Bernie Sanders, along with social movements like Black Lives Matter, would usher in a sea change in U.S. politics. I could go on and on. Actually, I should mention that, of course, I was a supporter, like most people in the U.S. left, of socialist alternatives runs for local office in places like Boston and Minneapolis. And I was definitely an early supporter of Sama's campaign. But I didn't anticipate how much it would transform politics in Seattle, how much politics in Seattle could be transformed with a single city council seat, and also the way in which that seat could help push forward the struggle for a Fight for 15 at a national level as well. That shows the power of our bully pulpit, if used right by socialists. It shows the power of determined organization and the power of our ideas, and the audience out there, people really looking for an alternative, looking for a clear message that says it's not their fault. All these different crises that they're going through, all these things are the product of not individual failures, but rather these are social problems, and social problems demand a collective solution. That being said, I think it's important that we draw some lessons from the last 5 years, not just the pandemic. Before that, that guides our practice going forward. I think one thing for now is to conceive of our task on the left as primarily one in this era of class reformation. And by that, what I mean is, let's say you were a young left-wing organizer, any age really, and you're organizing in Italy in the 1970s. You could go to a town in Italy, you could go to Bologna, you could go to Milan, you could go somewhere, and you might find yourself in a working class area around town, and it'd be clear to you that, this is the working class, that these are people who maybe are working in a few dominant firms, maybe they were industrial workers, maybe they were just working in small shops or whatnot. But by and large, there was a certain culture. There was a certain manner of dress. There was, more importantly, at the political level, activity in certain civic organizations. There was political allegiance that disproportionately swung to either socialist or communist. And for the young radical, we would be able to say, well, there is this class out there. This class is organized to a degree. It's organized around parties that are programmatically socialist. It's organized in such a way that the self-conception of these people are of workers. There's a level of active trade union consciousness, a deep rootedness in organization, and there's some connection with the left. And of course, we wish that the parties that they're associated with were more programmatically radical. We wish that there was different tactics being pursued, but there was this kind of awareness of class and this rootedness and this base to go from. I think right now we have to acknowledge how fragmented and how splintered the left is. Over the last 5 years, we finally have resurrected a left that says, okay, the working class matters, after losing a lot of that for much of the 90s and parts of the 2000s. But now we need a left that can figure out how to activate the fighting capacities of the working class. So it's not enough to just assert that this class matters, and this class, based on its particular leverage and power in the economy, has the potential to reshape the world. We have to figure out how to organize and activate it. And I think for now, my second point is that electoral politics is the best avenue for us to do this change. I once thought that electoral politics were merely a barometer of how well we were doing organizing in civil society. We would organize our campaigns, we would organize extra-parliamentarily, then we would run elections, and elections would just be a test of our strength. I think, in fact, electoral politics is the opening in which we're breaking through and we're repoliticizing a very hollowed out civil society. So my own thinking over the past 5-6 years have kind of switched and reversed itself. And I do think this emphasis on electoral politics as a means to class reformation in the short term is different than electoralism. And among other examples, I think the example of politics in Seattle is a great way to look at how a campaign for elected office, especially one in which you win, and the bully pulpit elected office can be used to spark different forms of politicization. And it can be used to make the issues that matter to us the dominant issues of the day. So the right wants the dominant issues of the day to be this culture war. They want the dominant issue of the day to be immigration and all these things. We want it to be things like $15 and a union, that demand, or the demand for Medicare for all. And by using our campaigns and using our bully pulpit and actually getting results, we've been in some cases able to do that. And I think similarly, we do need a clear message, and we need a message that doesn't downplay oppression, and particularly the need for struggles against, and the particular need for struggles against oppression. But we need to foreground demands that bind together and unify a very fragmented working class with these common demands. So primarily, I think these are demands around economic egalitarian demands, or demands for better wages, or demands for universal social goods. There's demands that speak to a common narrative in which every working person, regardless of where they're from, regardless of their background, can be a protagonist. And I think that means speaking plainly to the common sense of people. I think that means naming the enemy, naming the things that we can do to improve lives, and avoiding the jargon of both the progressive NGO world and the jargon that often comes with academia, and the fact that a lot of the left has been isolated without a mass base in academic and more generally middle-class milieus. So it's here I think we have much to learn from figures like Bernie Sanders, much to learn about how to plainly communicate, how to reach people who never thought of themselves as political actors or socialist or whatever else, but have within them the capacity, because of their position in the economy as workers, to change the world. And this means, I believe, running on a few issues and making those issues salient. So in the United States, issues like Medicare for all, issues like a jobs guarantee, issues like $15 in a union, these are clear issues that should be defining litmus tests for any campaign we run. And our core message, whatever it is, maybe it's not those issues, maybe it's something else, it should be so simple. It should be a message that tells people that they, in fact, through politics, through organizing, can get a better life, and through taking on the interests of millionaires and billionaires can get a better life. It should be so simple that it should fit on the back of an envelope. And that's more or less all I have to say. I mean, I think that what we've found in the last 5 years is we found the basics of our politics. We found that actually people have been yearning for the type of politics that tells them that their life can be better, that tells them that it's not their fault, and that tells them that they are the heroes in a story that's going to transform not only their lives, but the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And that's simply something that mainstream parties are not doing. That's something that the fearmongers of the far right certainly are not doing, and the right populists. And it's something that liberals aren't doing. At best, the best liberals just want people to sit back and enjoy some technocratic tweaks that will make their life a little bit better. We actually have a role for working people in creating history.
Thanks very much, Bhaskar. Now, last but not least, Vladimir, please.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very glad to be here and to take part of this type of discussion that for me is really a very important and beautiful one. Well, if I understood, I'm supposed to present, let's say, what's happening in Latin America now. Then I prepare a little text that I would like to read about, let's say, this last months, what happened in this last months in Latin America. And actually, I would like to start by a word that was presented by Álvaro Uribe. Álvaro Uribe is a former president of Colombia, and actually he's the effective leader of the extreme right that now governs the country. And it was very interesting because faced with unprecedented uprisings that took the streets of Colombia, that are taking the streets of Colombia now, until now, let's say, for these last 2 months, making the government get rid of a tax reform project of tax reform that made once again the poorest to pay the cost of the pandemic. Well, Uribe could not think of a better idea than to call on his people to fight against a dissipated molecular revolution that was taking over the country. And it's true that we must recognize Uribe was right. And normally the right-wing politicians understand first what is going on. Well, Latin America, or at least a substantial part of the continent, it's going through a series of popular uprisings. And let's say Colombia, Chile, well, we see what's happening in Peru now, and Argentina, especially with the feminist movements. Well, all these popular uprisings which strength comes from unprecedented articulations between, let's say, a radical refusal of the neoliberal economic order, upheavals that reveals all levels of violence that compose our social body, and also models of, let's say, insurrectionary organization of wide extension. The image of struggles against tax reform facing trans subjects in affirmation of their social dignity, or unemployed people barricading together with feminists explain well what molecular revolution means in this context. Because it means that we are facing uprisings that are not centralized in a line of command, and that create situations that can reverberate struggles against naturalized disciplines that had colonized our bodies, as well as against macrostructures of plunder of working class labor. These are uprisings that operate transversally putting into question in a non-hierarchical way all levels of the structures of reproduction of social life. And I would like to insist that, in fact, the 21st century started that way. Those who believe that the 21st century began on September 11 with the attack of the World Trade Center are mistaken. That's the way some would like to tell it. For it would be the way to place the century under the sign of fear of the terrorist threat that never passes, actually that becomes a normal form of government. Yeah? To place our century under the paranoid sign of the threatening frontier of invaded identity, as if our fundamental political demands were security and police protection. Well, in fact, the 21st century began in a small town in Tunisia called Sidi Bouzid on December 17, 2010. In other words, it started far from the spotlight, far from the centers of the global capitalism. It started on the periphery. And that day, a street merchant, Mohamed Bouazizi, decided to complain to the regional governor and demand the return of his fruit care, which had been confiscated by the police. A constant victim of police extortion, Bouazizi went to the head of the government with a copy of the law in his hand. And he was greeted by a policewoman who tears the copy in front of him and slapped him on the face. Bouazizi then set his own body on fire. And after that, Tunisia never was the same again. Tunisia went into a turmoil. The Ben Ali government fell, leading to uprisings in almost every Arab country. Thus began the 21st century with a body immolated for not accepting to submit to power. Then began the Arab Spring, with an act that said better death than subjection, with a very particular conjunction between a restricted action, a complaint about having his fruit car seized, and an agonistic reaction, immolated oneself. That this conjunction that reverberates through every pore of the social body. And since then, the world saw a chain of uprisings for 10 years. Occupy Plaza del Sol, Istanbul, Brazil, Gilets Jaunes, Tel Aviv, Santiago. There are just a few places where this process has gone. And in Tunisia, we could already see what the world would know in the next 10 years, in this last 10 years. Multiple uprisings which occurs at the same time, which refuse centralism and which articulate in the same series Egyptian women who asserted themselves with breasts on display on social networks and general strikes. Most of these uprisings will struggle against the most brutal reactions, which face the organization of the most archaic sectors of society in an attempt to preserve powers as it always was. But there are moments when repetition ends up to generate a qualitative change. And 10 years later, this occurred. This happened in Chile. Chile elected a new constituent assembly in May. And after massive demonstrations in October 2019 that made the Chilean streets burn until the government stopped killing its own population and accept calling for a constitutional process, Chile elected 155 constituent deputies, of which 65 are independent, not linked to the structure of a party, but united, like, for example, the 24 deputies of the Lista del Pueblo, in a fight for, and I quote them, environmental, egalitarian, and participatory state. 77 deputies are women, making it the only constituent assembly in world history to have real parity. 18 are native peoples, all of whom are present, from the Rapa Nui of Eastern Iceland to the Mapuche. And the right wing, which was eager to reach at least 1/3 of the seats, to be able to block constitutional change, will have only 37 deputies. Well, the absolutely unique character of the Chilean process is found in the fact that it is produced as, let's say, a insurrectionary institutionalization. It was the result of an uprising that immediately demanded a new institutional framework. Icelanders in Iceland tried this when the economic crisis produced that popular mobilizations that ended up producing a new constitution. However, Parliament did not recognize the new constitution, aborting the process. Well, such Chilean exceptionality must be understood in light of the Chilean path to socialism. Salvador Allende's government from 1970 to 1973 sought to carry out a real Marxist program through a progressive mutation of social life that preserved large parts of the structure of liberal democracy. Many criticized this strategy after the coup d'etat, but we should remember their reasons. It was the way the Chileans found to stop the militarization of social life, as it usually happened in all revolutionary processes up to now. There was a real issue that Chile sought to solve by innovating. In a way, the interrupted process now is back, 47 years later. Since the student riots in the Bachelet government, Chile has seen student leaders become deputies to wrest a reform from Congress that made the public education system free. Now they have made the unprecedented move of only leaving the streets with a constituent assembly in their hands, which the Tunisians only achieved years after the formation of the first post-dictatorship government. By coupling the two processes, Chile allowed insurrectionary enthusiasm to command the constitutional process, institutionalizing its molecular revolution. Well, the spectator, I would like to end just saying that the spectator, as my case, who sees all this from Brazil, wonders what happens to us, because Brazil, it's a 45% of all the Latin American GDP. It's a very central country. However, those who think that such a dynamic will not reach Brazil are mistaken. It just so happens that we will encounter a much more dramatic situation. For Brazil is the country in which the force of reaction organized themselves in an insurrectionary way. There are expressive sectors of the population that went and will go to the streets to ask for a military coup and defend the fascism of those who govern us today. Within the logic of preventive counter-revolution, Brazil, unlike other Latin American countries, was able to mobilize the dynamics of a popular fascism. Therefore, the trend scenario among us is one of an uprising against another uprising, a fascist revolution against a dissipated molecular revolution. It would be better for us to be prepared for it. Well, it's that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thanks to all the panelists for keeping to time and for really insightful presentations. We do now have close to half an hour for questions. There are a number of them already in the Q&A section, which I'll get to in a minute. But I would like to just raise a question for the panelists as a whole, the panel as a whole. It seems like there are a number of themes that have come through your presentations. I mean, you've covered a lot of ground, but the key ones seem to be, the prospects of electoralism or an electoral strategy for the left. I like the way that Bhaskar put this in terms of the basis for kind of recomposition of the working class. There's a need for unity, and I think those two are very closely connected. And I think one of the counter tendencies here, especially in North America, is a very damaging identity politics, which has only deepened, it seems, in the last few years. And this is something also that Vladimir has confronted in Brazil too. In fact, he's been part of a film project that addresses this, I think, very directly and in a fascinating way. And finally, and I think that the really key thing here, and this comes right out of Vladimir's presentation, but it's echoed in each and every one of the presentations, and that is a need for an internationalism and a global perspective. So one of the things that I think would be interested to hear you reflect on a little bit are, so not only the electoral shortcomings of Corbyn. I mean, I think that Kshama's point was really well taken in terms of if the ruling class isn't up in arms at the prospects of your electoral triumph, then you know you're doing something wrong. But we know that Corbyn was obviously doing something right at the helm of the Labour Party when there was such a wave of opposition, largely centering on made-up charges of anti-Semitism that really helped to scupper the party's fortunes in the last election. And there's, of course, Sanders' run as well. And we know this. We've seen this film, and we know the details. But I'm wondering if we could look a bit beyond the global north and look to places like India, West Bengal, Kerala. The left has been successful for decades. Obviously, Bolivia. Peru and Chile, as Vladimir was reflecting upon. Also the PT, I know Vladimir is quite critical in some ways of the PT, but that was also in its own way quite successful. So what can we learn in these respects from the global South and the electoral successes of the left there? That often gets left out of these discussions, and I'm wondering if we can bring them back in terms of successful left strategies and really decent governance, and in states like Kerala and India, I think. So just throw that open, and then I'll come to some of the questions from the audience. Whoever would like to begin. I'm wondering if we should go back to start with Nikki and then go through. Yeah.
Sure. Well, first off, I think we've got right off the bat so much to gain from building an international movement of solidarity. And that's, I mentioned the Progressive International work, and I know it came up in the chat as well. It's still a nascent network of activists, advocates, elected folks, and others who are seeking transformative change. And one of the most inspiring pieces that I found is the struggles being led in the global South. In fact, this vaccine internationalism summit this weekend is being led by leaders from the global South, from Cuba, from Argentina, from Kerala, from Chile, from Kenya, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how they've been, fighting in every way possible and building, solutions to keep keep their people safe, whether it's through, what vaccine production they can muster, or investments in public health care. But at the same time, they're making very clear that the global north is a major obstacle and of course a contributor to a system that is literally killing their people, right, and ravaging the global south. So I think it's really critical that we learn what's happening. That we learn how these movements, these people's movements, and I'm thinking particularly in Latin America, have become so much stronger. I mean, we've had the recent results come out of Peru as well. How is this happening? And how is that solidarity being built between workers' movements, between indigenous communities and others, and very much obviously an increasingly shared anti-capitalist vision, right? And how has both the agenda, but also the organizing been successful, right? So I think that's something that we could definitely learn from, but obviously we're not just there to learn. We need to take heed of the call to get our countries, and I'm speaking specifically to Canada, to cease being part of the problem, right? Whether it's pushing our own imperialist agenda in Latin America, or failing to lift the intellectual property patents on vaccine technology, right? So we've got lots to learn, but I think we have solutions here in our own midst, and I really appreciated Kshama's and Bhaskar's, everybody's contribution in terms of the shifting working class, the bold politics we need, the way in which we need to pierce through the performative politics, including within our own movements. There's no shortage of work to be done here. I just don't think certainly some of the folks that I hang out with at times are listening to those to that movement on the ground, are respecting it, and are willing to build that solidarity with those movements. So lots of work to be done here and around the world, and I encourage folks to join PI as well. I mean, speaking of Jeremy Corbyn, I know many folks, I'm sure those involved, I know, of course, Derek and others, Sven, were very supportive of the event we did with Jeremy Corbyn, which many people, including in so-called progressives within our own universe, were very critical of, right? I mean, if that's not a sign that we have a lot of work to be done to bring people along, and I don't know what is. But having said that, whether it was that event or other events, including tonight, there's such a hunger for a bold progressive politics and organizing within our own community. So let's keep doing it.
Kshama, do you want to come in?
Sure. Thank you so much for the questions, and I appreciated Nikki's comments as well. I think I'll try to, in a few minutes, sort of tie in the points you made, Samir, about Corbyn, and also what lessons we can learn from the global south. And I'll bring in a few points about India. And I think that's a very important point you brought up, Samir, that yes, there was no shortage of attacks against Corbyn. So what failed there? What was really problematic there? And I think there we have to understand that, again, there's a lot to be said about this, but very quickly, Corbyn's real problem was that his loss of credibility in the minds of the working class who wanted to fight for him, who wanted to fight for a real working class program and defeat the Blairite labor. But his real problem was a loss of the credibility after 4 years as labor leader, where he failed to take on the neoliberal right inside the Labour Party, really failed to provide a fighting avenue for people who wanted to fight the Blairites and to seek to seriously build a mass movement for change outside of Parliament. That is a fundamental failure, and in that sense, it connects to the phenomena we're seeing in different nations, including in the United States. What is lacking in terms of left leadership in the United States as well. Ironically, we have to keep in mind, Corbyn won the leadership of the party because the Blairites, who were full of hubris, made it easier for people to join the party and vote for party leader and so on and so forth. But the moment that Corbyn was democratically elected by the membership, which should have been the sort of the turning point, for the Corbyn left to really, really absolutely exploit that opportunity to push a working class agenda and bring a fighting strategy. At that time, there was a failure to do that, and that allowed the right-wing majority of the Labour MPs to undermine him and then remove him. And obviously, as you pointed out, just absolutely vile and false attacks against him of being an anti-Semite, just a full court press of the Red Scare phenomenon. So I think that those are points we should bring in. And let's just quickly on what can we learn from the electoral successes of the left. You mentioned West Bengal and Kerala. Obviously, there's a long history here with the communist parties having had some degree of success in those two states and having put forward, not so much West Bengal, but Kerala is a better example of much more successfully bringing forward social democratic reform. So if you look at some of the demographic indicators like life expectancy, literacy of women, and so on, Kerala has for decades been ahead of the national average. So all of that is important. But I think we should understand, when you dig a little bit into the history of how these victories were won, it wasn't so much that it was the communist parties. There are lots of problems in the leadership there. I'm a Marxist, and there are lots of good people there, and we want to build links with them, but we also have our criticisms. And I think really to the extent that things succeeded in Kerala for the working class, it was the extent to which the rank and file were empowered in labor struggles. And that really put pressure on the leadership of the communist parties there to really push for those reforms. I think that's what's behind it. And of course, it's important. We should not underestimate the importance of the BJP, Modi's party, this right-wing Hindu fundamentalist, reactionary, odious party being defeated in the state elections in West Bengal just a few weeks ago. That is important. It shows the anger that the working class has against the COVID debacle that Modi has overseen. Absolute catastrophe where we are seeing bodies being lined up everywhere. It's just completely unbelievable. But it's also important to remember, for example, in the West Bengal context, it's important that BJP was defeated, but the ruling party in West Bengal, led by Mamata Banerjee and the Trinamool Congress, really doesn't. There are differences between them. Very clearly, they're not a reactionary party like the BJP. But historically, all of these parties have been extremely lacking in providing any real alternative to the BJP, which is the only thing that explains how, despite the anger against Modi, and it is not just from COVID, anger against Modi goes many years back, starting especially with the demonetization fiasco, where there was a real opportunity to build links between the working class as a whole and the labor movement, but also some of the more sort of small business type layers who were also very angry, better paid bank employees were angry. There was such widespread anger against the demonetization fiasco. It was a golden opportunity for a real left party to make gains then. But it's quite stunning that even despite repeated general strike actions, which have been each time the general strike actions have been the largest labor mobilizations in world history, and this has happened now 3 times. And despite all of that, the BJP has won and re-won elections. And that shows not that people have illusions in the BJP. To some degree, yes, it's not all homogeneous and monolithic, but for the most part, there is a real dismantling of the illusions, but there's a lack of a real alternative. And so it's interesting that it's different than the US in the sense that there's a multitude of parties. It's not just Democrats and Republicans, but not one of those parties is actually up to the task of actually uniting the left and actually fighting for the working class. So even in India, I think if we were there, we would be arguing for a real new left party for the working class. And in fact, just a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal published an article where it shows how ordinary people, they're angry against Modi, but when you ask them, what will you do in the next central government elections, they say, I'll probably vote for the BJP because I don't know what else to do. So I think that also shows how globally, internationally, this is our task for the left to provide actual fighting alternatives to the reactionary parties, and also to parties like the Democrats, who are different than the reactionary parties, but at the same time are also still, their masters are the same Wall Street interests.
Thanks very much. Just before we go on, I'm hoping that the panelists wouldn't mind sticking around a little bit over time, if that's possible. If not, that's fine as well. But we do have a number of questions, and I'd like to get to them. But I'd also like to allow you to give fulsome answers, like you've just given to these questions. So let's see how things go. Bhaskar.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually just say, obviously, internationalism is important, but I think that at least in the history of the U.S. left, internationalism hasn't been the problem. I think we often forget, because the U.S. is this big imperial power, we often, I think, forget the actual history of the small left with the U.S., which is, one of the few parties, socialist parties around the world that opposed World War I. I think consistently has been the right side of struggles against war. Consistently has been involved even in our bleakest moments when we were at our weakest, in the late 70s and 1980s with solidarity with Central America, the fight against apartheid in South Africa. There was this constant, I think, very important activism and intervention in the US. And obviously, I think especially where the US is causing immediate harm, like the devastating sanctions against Venezuela, like the embargo with Cuba, I think that's a particular duty and importance for us. But the best way for us to help those in the global South and to participate in the project of internationalism isn't necessarily just to look at what people are doing from afar and be really excited by it, which is, I think, often is has a certain skin deep appeal, but rather for us to organize where we are in our own local contexts and in our own national contexts, of course, as anti-imperialists, but organizing workers right here to see that, their struggles to have a better life is perfectly compatible with the struggle of other people to have a better life. So especially at a time when our elites are ramping up a competition with China and these Cold War narratives, just basically saying, actually, it's a good thing that people are enjoying the fruits of their labor and development in places like China, obviously, while still being critical of many things that the CCP is doing in China, but also that this isn't a zero-sum game. This isn't taking anything off your plate and so on. So I think the harder task is to think about how, in these other contexts, these parties, whether we agree with everything they do or not, they're deeply embedded with a mass social base. And that's something we're losing in our parties, or we in the US really never haven't really had. But in countries like Europe, left-wing and center-left parties are losing a lot of their mass base. So what would it take to reintegrate with everyday life? What would it take for when people to have problems, the recourse wouldn't be just family networks alone or just personal despondency alone, but rather politics. Whether, I'm sure in Seattle, if somebody has a issue with a landlord, they could go over to Sama's office. Like, what would it be like for that to exist in every city and every community, for them to have some sort of association with the left, as not just people who will offer nice lines about solidarity, but it can offer real material change and redress. And I think that's our project. So, of course, I'm in favor of internationalism. I'm extremely excited by developments like in Colombia, like in Peru and elsewhere. But I think we've had a left for a very long time in the US that's been excited about developments abroad. And it's about time that we give people abroad something to be excited by, because God knows if we didn't have such a reactionary government in the US, then things would be a lot better for our comrades in places like Cuba.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's often not just a matter of cheerleading, but actually looking at models that are actually quite successful, like the history of municipal socialism in Vienna and so on. So it was really
but I think those contexts are completely alien in part because those are our experiments, both in the global South today in a lot of these places, and from the heyday of Second International Social Democracy and afterwards, of a rising working class just forming and just finding a political voice. I think and this sounds maybe surprising considering my own politics and orientation, my own reference points, but I think a lot of our politics in the 21st century is obviously, for me, maintaining the core of Marxism, maintaining the commitment to socialism, but a tactical and organizational reinvention. There's and in a weird way, even though obviously we believe moral and ethically that all these struggles are of the same worth, I was more interested in the outcome of the class struggle in the UK, because they ran into a lot of the same problems we would run into in our national contexts, and they were defeated. So in a way, not at any moral level, but at a purely tactical level, I think those are the most relevant examples.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to turn it over to Vladimir now. But Vladimir has also learned a lot about the Arab Spring and how that also has influenced Occupy and those struggles. So these are all quite interconnected as well. Vladimir, on to you, and then we'll open it up to some audience questions as well as we near the end of the session. Yeah.
Okay, I will just try to say some quick topics. The first, I agree too that the major challenge is a type of international solidarity based on working class movements. But I would like to insist that just international solidarity is not enough. There is a real challenge to create a kind of international agenda, and especially international coordinate actions. And because we don't have a space of international space of discussion, we don't have an international space of decision, then just solidarity, this would be really something that I think that is not enough for what we really need. Because we know that even if we have some difference in our countries, the global capitalism is the same, and these differences are organized in the type of system that what happened in some place, what happened in Canada, in the United States, we will feel that in Latin America, and it's what happened in Latin America can be something that let's say other parts of the world will feel too. Because I think that what is interesting in Latin American situation is now we have this conscious that there is a type of transversal connection between anti-neoliberalism, that it's a result of this acknowledgement that there is a suicidal tendency in neoliberal total absence of solidarity, total absence of sensibility concerning the most impressive levels of death. Brazil is a biggest example on that. But there's a transversal connection between that and this conscious of there is our politics was until now the continuation of colonialism by other means, and maybe this when we understand that the only way to deal with that is fighting against structures, and this I think this was the Chilean let's say situation was so interesting because they organized their fights. The struggles against the structure of the societies, means the constitution, the parliament, and so on. It was not just to change governments; that was really to rebuild the country. And I think that this could be a kind of example for another types of situation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's move on then. We have a question from a student, and this is Amanda Woods. How can young people get organized in the ever-growing precarious job market, and what is the role of young workers and students in building a fighting force capable of taking down the capitalist system? Throw it open, whoever would like to respond. Not everybody needs to, but I'll just throw it out there.
I mean, my only contribution would be to say, being organized in your workplace is often not not possible. It's very difficult, right? We often, as socialists, think about the contradictions of capitalism, but the reason why capitalism has proved so resilient over the last 150 years is that it's marked more by mechanisms of stability. It's marked also by mechanisms of stability, in part the fact that you need your groceries, which you get through working for your boss more than your boss needs your individual contribution to work, which is why it's so difficult to organize. But what you can do, no matter what your situation is get involved outside of work in a socialist organization, get involved in some broader, solidarity groups and things in civil society. So that option is always there. And obviously our role on the left is to create the kind of infrastructures of dissent that makes resistance and collective action a more viable option for workers. But work has always been really precarious. You should read about the conditions of even sectors we think of as highly, highly organized today, like longshore workers or auto work or things like that. It was incredibly precarious and incredibly, workers getting fired on the spot, on the line, in the docks. If you ever watch a really old movie of like a bunch of they show a bunch of guys showing up at the dock and some foreman being like, you, like you're the ones who gets picked to work for the day. Like that's what it was. And we turned those sectors into the bastions of working class strength. So obviously in the future, despite how precarious the job market is, there will be those organizing opportunities too.
Thanks, Bhaskar. I'm going to move on. Nikki, go ahead. Do you want to add to that?
I really appreciate that was a question, and a question we got to early on, because I think we need to elevate that struggle in ways that we haven't before. In fact, a few years ago, I hosted the first conference of its kind on the rise of precarious work on Parliament Hill. In fact, I was the first MP, I guess, of any party to talk about the rise of precarious work, particularly in a generational context. Many people, particularly those in the established trade union movement, didn't know what to do with it. Right? There were certainly people that let's be open to the discussion, but it takes a move out of one's comfort zone to actually engage with it. And I think we really need to recognize how young workers are taking creative steps to organize their workplaces, to be active in their workplaces. Many of us are inspired by movements to organize Amazon workers, certainly in the States, and something we're watching closely here. But I think we also need to be clear, right? The value of electoral politics is also pushing for legislation to allow workers to unionize and organize more effectively. And so it is also incumbent on those of us in this work to push for that kind of legislation and legislation that responds to this growing precarity that's often used as an excuse for not being able to unionize. And coming out of COVID-19, where we all applauded essential workers, the reality is that many it was in some workplaces where there was high rates of unionization, where people fared better than others, but not always the case, as we know, for example, in meatpacking plants. So really, we need to see bolder activism, more substantive activism, and there's hope, right? I mean, I mentioned the steelworkers in Sudbury. It's actually mostly young workers, in this case unionized, who told their bargaining team that no, we're not voting for this garbage collective agreement. We're going to fight back against a multinational. So it's the ground is shifting, and we've got to be there, including pushing for legislative changes.
Thank you, Kshama.
Thank you. Just very quickly, just to add to some of the points, I think Nikki brought up a very important point about how young people are moving into action, into struggle. And in fact, even when you look at the profile of workers in workplace-related struggle, it is, for a big part of that is younger workers leading that, because we see this in every era of social movements. Young people, whether we're talking about social movements against oppression or workplace actions, it is young people who have the most at stake, and also young people who are the least in their minds entrenched with the status quo. And so not surprisingly, we are seeing that again. I mean, if you look at the profile of most of the people who marched in Black Lives Matter last year in this almighty movement, it was young people. Young people have been at the forefront of the climate struggle. Young people have been also among those at the forefront of unionization struggle. Nikki mentioned the Amazon-related unionization struggles. So I don't think that there's any shortage or any, we should not be in any way demoralized about this, in the sense that young people want to move into struggle. They are looking for avenues to move into struggle. But I think once again, this comes back to the question of what leadership we provide. So for example, the BLM movement, even though it was such an earth-shattering movement in terms of the size of the scale of the street protests, the victories won by the movement have not been commensurate with the strength of the movement itself. And I think this is leading a lot of more serious politicizing young people to think about what is the strategy that is necessary in order to win victories, and in order to actually, especially in the question of climate justice, how do we actually win, how do we save the planet, really? Basically, that's what it comes down to. And I think that's why it is important for socialist organizations and the socialist movement as a whole to take seriously really bringing in young people into the movement and really having, really putting forward an active discussion and debate where young people can speak. And I'll just also add that that's precisely the reason that Socialist Alternative and our international Socialist Alternative movement has actually is taking that very seriously. And I would really urge young people who are watching this or listening to this to look into that.
Thanks very much. Just like to follow up on a kind of related question, which has to do with strategy and tactics. Really, there's a reluctance on the part of politicians, on the part of leftist politicians, socialists, to use the language of socialism to reach out to the working class. And it would seem right now in the pandemic to be a particularly good time to do this, right? As the pandemic brings a unique optic to our contemporary neoliberal landscape, where we see in greater relief the effects of colonialism, white supremacy, Islamophobia, patriarchy, anti-Semitism, heteronormativity, etc., worker exploitation, especially environmental destruction, and so on. These are inherent in capitalism, but they become, I think, particularly clear in the context of the pandemic. I think people have already touched upon this, that the most precarious workers are often hit the hardest, although not always. As the meat packing plant example shows us. But it seems like racialized people, women, are hit particularly hard. Isn't this a good time to really re-inject the language of socialism back into public life? And why hasn't this happened to an extent that we might expect?
Well, I could speak a bit to the Canadian context, and I would say there is, I think, increasingly a hunger, whether people use the word socialism or not, for a socialist transformative vision for our world. One of the phrases, as I know many of in this event know, I ran for the leadership of our party almost 4 years ago, and one of the we actually got T-shirts printed with it. One of the key rallying cries was people over profit, right? And it tied into the bold economic agenda that we put forward, the bold call for green transition, tied into our calls for Indigenous justice, for anti-imperialist work, and what I would say is, in the last year, I've never seen more people use that exact same slogan to define their struggle here in our own country, and whether or not they recognize it to be reflective of socialist values, there's a shift happening. But what I also see is folks certainly on the established side of our political parties feel very uncomfortable with socialism and bold policies that would be tied into that exact same slogan. slogan. But I do think that it's to our own peril to ignore a socialist agenda and a transformative agenda, because as Kshama and others have pointed out, young people, and increasingly the greatest of voting demographics, they're certainly their values tend to be more to the left in terms of state involvement, in terms of support around housing, free education, action on the climate emergency, and so if you've got a bunch of watered down policies and still use the hashtags, it's not going to cut it, right? You have to deliver bold progressive politics, a bold progressive agenda to mobilize and inspire people, particularly young people, and I would say working people as well. I come from I represent a working class community. This is my community. This is where I come from an industrial part of the country, surrounded by First Nations who have been exploited, and so not urban, none of that. And I will say people here are hungry for a different way of doing things, right? I've been committed for years now to doing that work on the ground, but there are still a number of minds that need to be changed in Ottawa, on Bay Street, our Wall Street, that still tie into our political parties and our political movements, and I would say the labor movement, established labor movement as well. So it's the word is coming back. I mean, when people like Bernie and Jeremy and others used it, for so many of us, it was like, hallelujah, finally it's in the mainstream, but we have a lot of work to be done here, and it's not because people aren't there. It's because people, including in our own so-called progressive spaces, are still reticent to embrace that reality and make room for that reality, and most importantly, those bold ideas.
Yeah, well, so there are a couple of questions that go specifically to the NDP and its kind of political inertia. But I think it can be expanded to address the situation in Brazil under 3T as well as in the United States. So unionization is vital to left politics, but it cuts both ways, doesn't it? I mean, we don't need to invoke Lenin here in terms of trade union consciousness. There's a certain kind of conservatism as well in the trade union movement that actually also would actively disavow the language of socialism. With Corbyn as well, he's being critiqued for not, in a sense, taking, and Kshama, you raised this as well. I mean, he didn't have a lot of support in the North. He has a lot of support, or had a lot of support amongst sort of urban metropolitan elites, particularly in cities like London. And so there is a kind of reluctance, it seems, on the part at least of the established unions, to adopt a kind of a socialist vocabulary. There's a real sense of alienation on the left about the NDP government here in BC because of the fact that, amongst other things, it's now in the process of logging an old-growth forest on Vancouver Island. It's run roughshod over Indigenous rights, and this isn't just because it's favoring industry, but it also has ties to organized labor, which are inertia producing, right? So I think this is a key question. Maybe this is a question that we can sort of wrap the panel up on. How do we confront this as a challenge for the left? I mean, this was also one of the criticisms of the PT, that it had these sort of conservatizing tendencies within it, and didn't, in a sense, radicalize and transform its constituents into a kind of working class movement. It encouraged its supporters to think of themselves as aspirants to the middle class. So I'd just like to throw that open, and then I think we can wrap.
Samir, if I can just say something, because actually it's 2:30 in the morning for me, and I'm totally knocked. I will just say that, and I will go. I think that we are facing a kind of a global tendency in politics to go to the extremes, and we see this for these last 10 years. Actually, the thing is that, well, the extreme right was able to do this first, and they organize a kind of, let's say, anti-institutional perspective of, well, first from the left. Actually, I think it's just now that the left is understanding that we cannot deal with the agreements in liberal democracy anymore, and we should be able to present for people that see that they are getting poor, they are getting in a very precarious situation, something that is not just a well done organization of the systems. Then I think that we will see a kind of trend to reorganize these extreme positions, and especially on the left, because it's true that we see how, well, even the word socialism, it's own on the topics again. What if you think 3 years ago, 4 years ago, nobody will say I'm socialist, and what is not the case anymore, and what is it's something that can make us with a little hope. What is that? I need to get out.
Thanks very much, Vladimir. Good night. Thank you. Yeah.
I should let Nikki get the last word because, you know, it's a Canadian event. It's her home turf. But you know, I do think that a lot of these questions are very difficult at the abstract level. Like in Corbyn's case, I think a lot of his losses of Labour's heartlands were very contingent. Basically, the election became about Brexit, and it became about something that wasn't our strongest issue. If the election was still around the NHS, was about austerity, then we would have won that. I think, like Corbyn and like Tony Benn and a whole host of other people from that tradition in the UK, I happen to be very skeptical of Europe. But Corbyn had to band together a party with very divergent views on that issue, and I'm not sure there was a right move. So sometimes we'll just lose elections. I think there's a broader pattern, though, of de-alignment, of less poorer workers, of other people dropping out of political engagement. Often it's not the right that are winning over these people, but it's just them getting less and less engaged with politics. And our job is to obviously re-engage them. And it is to make the issues on which we're strongest more salient. And again, there's a certain way of saying that says, oh, ignore the culture war, which is just code for ignore issues of oppression. And I don't mean that. I mean, we should stick firm to our principles. We should remain credible on our issues. But we also need to make sure that the election's about the things where we already have majoritarian support. And the best way to help the oppressed, the best way to win over the other parts of our platform is to actually have this core coalition around it. So there's these recent studies that came out, which tell some this kind of common sense, which is that white Americans that are in unions are more progressive, and not just on economic issues, but they're more progressive on issues of race and gender and other things as well, because it's about getting people in the same tent together. So I want to find those issues. I want to find the big majoritarian demands that we could build around.
Great, thank you. Nikki, last word.
I was going to do a pitch for universal childcare. It's after hours, but that's the other task I've got on the go here. Well, first of all, I just want to say, to me, there are many signs of hope, including this event that we're putting together. I mean, the fact that we've had such inspiring voices, from our broader region, the Americas, a chance to really get into these issues, to me is a clear sign of how the world is shifting, the hunger for a bold, principled, transformative vision for our society. And I believe that coming out of this crisis, so many people, whether politicized or not, or have really come to a series of realizations. The way in which the system we know isn't necessarily broken, but that it was built this way. That these decisions were made intentionally. That their lives were put on the line, or in the case of those that lost them, as a result of conscious decisions. And so I think it is incumbent on parties like the one that I'm a part of, the NDP, and others elsewhere, to come to that realization that we need to be very clear and inspiring in the agenda we put forward, and that means substantive, transformative politics. I will say, obviously, in Canada, our electoral system is a huge part of the problem. We know that in other parts of the world, there are very inspiring left-wing coalitions of parties. And my personal background is from Greece, and of course we saw the emergence there of Syriza and also very active left-wing coalitions. I wish we could do that kind of work here in Canada, and I think we can in an activist sense, and that's happening to a certain extent. But certainly the system we have in place is a major barrier, despite our efforts to change it. Obviously, the establishment in our own country has been reticent to do so. But look, that's not an excuse to not hold our parties to account, not to demand better. I think we're seeing that already. I mean, the last NDP convention, anyone who follows the NDP on this call would have seen, the huge support for very progressive resolution on Palestine, which was the first time we've seen that, in many ways ever. And I want to acknowledge, I know Sven Robinson is part of this event. He was a key force in organizing people around that resolution, and another one on opposing the IHRA definition on anti-Semitism. And so what we saw is that even within our own parties, our established conventions as such, that hunger for change is pushing back on establishment views, status quo views, and demanding more and demanding better, as I believe are so many out in society. So let's get working on building that solidarity. I think there's so many parallels to be found. I think Canada is in a moment of it's an awakening that we're having right now around Indigenous justice, but perhaps around the broader struggle for justice. So let's keep going, and thank you for the strength to everyone, for the strength that you've shared, the solidarity you've shared. I think it's fuel for all of us on this call, and for whoever will watch. So let's keep it up. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before I sign off, Derek, would you like to come in? You have some final thoughts of your own.
Thanks to the speakers for hanging in there and for staying beyond time. We were joking beforehand about left-wing political culture in some places, and sometimes can handle 3-4 hour meetings. So thanks for everyone for staying for nearly the 2 hours. And Kshama obviously is in the midst of a really serious right-wing effort to get her out of office. I think they've tried twice to defeat her electorally after her initial election. She's now been elected 3 times. The last time, just a huge effort from Bezos and Amazon, sort of a personal vendetta to try to take her out, and now they're using a recall mechanism. So that's quite a serious threat she's under. So it's a great sign of internationalism that in the midst of that fight, she would join us today. And Nikki, great to have you on as well. I know you had some parliamentary procedures ongoing today, so thank you for fitting that into the schedule. And Vladimir's gone, but he stayed up till 2:30 in the morning. So really, showing us the indefatigable spirit of Latin American socialism and the movement there, which is winning new and unexpected victories. I just maybe that's a note to end the series on. And Bhaskar, I thought it was interesting that sort of the lessons and the focus you put on Corbyn, despite the defeat that became sort of almost inevitable in that last campaign, or felt inevitable, the forces aligned against the folks that had attempted that quixotic project. I think Jeremy Corbyn initially, literally just drew the short straw to be the candidate from the Socialist Campaign Group to run for leader. This was not a leadership run based on ambition or complete opposite. It was a sense of duty to fly that left flag. But yeah, that defeat certainly changed politics, I think, locally here in Vancouver and in Canada as well. That is Corbyn's near victory on a socialist program in an old sort of decrepit Labour Party. So I guess the point is that like even our defeats can be victories in terms of what they inspire elsewhere. And also just like victories for the left just appear where we least expect them. My partner is a Chilean exile where her family was exiled from the coup in Chile. And we just almost can't believe what we're seeing in Chile the last couple of years. Just last month, a series of communist mayors were elected. A Palestinian communist is currently leading the polls for the presidency in Chile this year. And most importantly, they've, as Vladimir so eloquently explained, they've sort of used a popular insurrectionary student-led movement or student-initiated movement that became a working class struggle of the whole society, with something like 15 to 20% of the whole society participating in mobilizations. A huge movement, and they've used that to draft the new constitution, where now the right wing will be unable to block constitutional measures to bring in basically a social democratic, somewhat decolonized constitution as well. With the Mapuche and other indigenous peoples having specific spots to help draft the constitution. So I guess I'll just end on the note of Chile, that sort of victory, and we know what happens when victories happen in Chile. Of course, there'll be real threats against that. But yeah, victories often happen where we least expect them. Peru is another case where I don't think many people expected Castillo to be able to eke out a victory there. So it's important for us in places like Canada where sometimes voices like Niki's seem marginal even within our parties of the left at times, because they're under such attack, and there aren't a lot of self-identifying socialists in the Canadian Parliament. It's important to keep plugging away and building solidarity and just inspiring others to do what you've been doing for many years now, Nikki. So just end on that note. The rest of the pandemic series sort of address specific topics and specific ways the pandemic has brought out the inequalities of capitalism. But I'm glad we were able to end on this really like explicitly political note. So all the videos of these sessions will be available on the Institute's website, and just encourage folks who might be tuning in for the first time to check out the website and sign up to support the Institute's ongoing work. It's been fun for me to help program these sessions, and yeah, thank you Samir for facilitating and yeah, leading the Institute, and thanks everyone for watching.
Yep. Well, thanks very much.
Watching and participating.
Yeah, and we'll hopefully see you back again. The next event that I think will be of interest is on the 27th of this month, looking at labor responses to the Indian farmer strike. So that'll be the 27th of June. The information will be on our website. So again, thanks to the remaining panelists. Really appreciate your presence, and we'll see you again. Bye.
All right, see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.